Hi, welcome back, everyone. Our next panel is titled How Long COVID is Impacting Work. We'll be hearing from four speakers and our first speaker will be Mike MacLellan. He is a lawyer practicing in all fields of labor and employment law. He joined Crawford, Chandon and Partners as an associate in 2010. Mike has appeared as an advocate at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, the Ontario Labour Relations Board, numerous labour arbitration boards, the Ontario Grievance Settlement Board, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, and various provincial courts. Mike's most gratifying work comes when he is able to assist employers and employees implement successful workplace accommodation plans, such as in respect of physical and mental health disabilities, including addictions and other episodic disabilities, and family status obligations, including childcare during the pandemic. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction, Gail, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. As Gail mentioned, I am a lawyer at a law firm in Brampton, Ontario, CC Partners, and my practice is exclusively advising and representing employers, and a good portion of this work is helping employers navigate the duty to accommodate in the workplace. And I'm happy to give a brief presentation on the duty to accommodate in the workplace. And it's going to be a brief presentation because lawyers are long-winded at the best of times, but this is a complicated topic. Melissa, I believe you have the presentation ready to be shared. So I'd like to just wait for that to go up. Great, thank you so much. So we'll get right into it. Again, this is an overview of the duty to accommodate at work from a legal perspective. So let's talk about the duty to accommodate and what that means. In Ontario, employers are governed by the Human Rights Code, and there's human rights legislation in the other 13 jurisdictions throughout Canada, including federally. And in short, the human rights law requires a process of accommodation, and that's what I like to encourage people to remember, that accommodation is a process. It's not simply the end result. An accommodation arises when somebody advises that they need some modification to their job due to a basis that's protected by the human rights legislation. Commonly, that's disability, and sometimes it's also something like family status or creed. Something along those lines. There's not always an easy solution for what the accommodation is, so we have to engage in the process. We have to gather some information, we have to engage with the employee and the employer, and where appropriate, a union, where there's a union involved, all in good faith, to try to gather the information we have and see what options are available to allow the employee to continue in meaningful, productive work. Keep in mind that, like I said, accommodation is a process, and when we end up with a dispute, and hopefully we don't, but when we do end up with a dispute over accommodation, the dispute is whether the process was undertaken in an appropriate fashion, as opposed to simply what the end result was. So again, accommodation is really intended to have the employee perform productive work on some modification of their core duties or the essential duties. And what factors I always try to keep in mind, and what's encouraged by the human rights legislation, is to undertake the accommodation process with an eye to dignity, individualization, and inclusion of the employee who we're trying to accommodate. Now, accommodation is a multi-party process. I want to talk a little bit about the employer's duties and the employee's duties. So first, let's look at the employer's role, and that'll be on the next slide. Thank you. So the duty to accommodate, legally speaking, rests on the employer. And that's why I get the call. The employer says, hey, I know I have this duty, but I'm not quite sure how to discharge this responsibility. The employer's role can, on occasion, start right at the outset of the process. There are, and this is an exception to the rule, but there are times when the employer will have a duty to inquire with the employee about whether they need some accommodation. This mainly happens where the employee is exhibiting some changes in their behaviors or their performance that can't really be explained readily. An employer may need to address the employee and ask, is there something going on that we need to be aware of so that we can bring you back to the level of performance or possibly conduct and behavior that we expect and require from you. An employer is required to accept a request for accommodation in good faith, which does not mean they have to grant every request for accommodation blindly. It means you have to accept that there is a request and undertake the process of accommodation in an appropriate fashion. It means being cooperative, it means doing your part, and it means not making assumptions. The employer has to investigate alternatives to the current work duties and employment terms of the person. Likely the employer is in the best position to know what alternatives are available, what modifications are possible. So again, the employer has to engage in that process with the employee to try to come to a reasonable accommodation plan. The employer is, of course, required to maintain confidentiality of the employee seeking the accommodation. This is, of course, to the extent possible. There may have to be some disclosure of sensitive information as a necessary element of the process of accommodation. And in this case, sometimes there's a little bit of a tension between what human rights law requires in the duty to accommodate and what privacy rights an employee should reasonably expect. So we have to navigate that as carefully as we can and infringe on privacy as little as possible. But part of that infringement of privacy, which we're not going to be able to get away from, is requesting medical information. The employer does have to get objective, reliable, credible information when an employee is asking for accommodation on the basis of disability, because again, it's up to the employer to be suggesting and trying reasonable accommodations within the employee's restrictions and limitations. So the employer has to ensure that it's asking for the right kind of information and only the information that they need in order to discharge their legal obligation to engage in the accommodation process. Of course, keeping the personal information private to the extent possible is again an obligation of the employer. And another element of the employer's duty to accommodate is assessing when they believe they're getting to what we call the threshold of undue hardship, in disclosing that to the employee. And again, if it's a union workplace, disclosing that to the union. Just like the employer is typically in the best position to understand what modifications may be available in the workplace, the employer is also in the best position to determine what might be an unreasonable accommodation and what might make the accommodation reach that undue hardship threshold. So the employer needs to be open, candid, and honest about what might constitute undue hardship. So now let's turn to the employee's role. In nearly all cases, it will be the employee's responsibility to request an accommodation and disclose the basis for their request for an accommodation. And just to give you an example, there are cases out there where an employee is terminated for poor performance or poor conduct or something along those lines. And afterward, when they're challenging their termination, they reveal that there was a health reason behind their conduct or behind their performance. Um, they may not be entitled to the remedy they otherwise would have been entitled to had they disclosed from the outset a need for accommodation and the basis for it. The employee is also required to provide the necessary information, and particularly when we're talking about a disability, all the necessary information regarding the disability. That includes from the outset, the general nature of the disability, what the restrictions and limitations are. It does not necessarily include an obligation to disclose your diagnosis or other information that might disclose what a diagnosis is. Personally, when I'm looking at accommodation plans on the basis of disability, I prefer not to know a diagnosis. I really just want to know the restrictions and limitations. That is really the basis that I'm going to be able to advise my client on what modifications they could possibly make to have the employee continue in employment, performing their core duties within this scope of restriction or limitation. But on that note, the employee is also responsible to disclose any changes in their conditions, whether the condition gets better, whether the condition gets worse, whether they have new restrictions, or whether they have restrictions that are no longer restrictions. That is part of the employee's duty to participate in the accommodation process. Cooperating in the accommodation process is itself a responsibility for the employee. That includes making best efforts to perform productive work, asking questions to the employer, answering questions to the employer, and remembering that accommodation is a process. Next is to accept reasonable accommodation. Employees sometimes believe that they're entitled to a particular accommodation, and that's not necessarily the case. Remember, accommodation is a process, and what the employee is entitled to is reasonable accommodation in the circumstances. They're not entitled necessarily to what would be their preferred or their perfect accommodation, but they're entitled to reasonable accommodation. And keep in mind that an employee is also required, where possible, to meet work standards. If you're being accommodated in a job with modifications that would allow you to perform productive work and you are not being productive, management still has a right to manage you, notwithstanding that you have some human rights protection and notwithstanding that you're in an accommodation plan. So I touched briefly on undue hardship, and I do need to come back to that topic now. If you could reverse one more slide, please, Melissa. Here we go. So the fact that there is an undue hardship threshold means that an employer must tolerate some hardship. Schedules have to be changed. Tasks have to be rearranged or reassigned. That is part of what employers have to accept and have to tolerate when they're discharging their duties pursuant to the human rights law. But undue hardship does not need to be tolerated. Undue hardship is meant to be determined objectively on a case-by-case basis, and it's typically something to do with costs or health and safety. With respect to costs, it could be an employee saying that in order for them to perform their work productively, the employer must change the physical layout of the workplace, including undertaking renovations, remodeling, or construction, or provide equipment that would just be cost prohibitive. In those cases, we reach undue hardship. Next is health and safety, and a conflict between human rights law and health and safety is that the employer also has a responsibility to ensure that health and safety in the workplace is at all times respected. That is a strict legal duty. I'll move forward to the last slide. We've heard some discussion today about long COVID and episodic disabilities. This is still kind of a new and emerging issue that's being accommodated. The key, really, in my view, is to remember that accommodation is a process, engage in it in good faith. Employers are going to need to be flexible. Things like work from home strategies and changing schedules are to be expected. That's my time. Again, I have lots more to say about this, but I appreciate being able to address you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's very helpful to have that overview of that process and the reminder that it is a process and there are obligations from both the employer and the employee. Our next speakers are Anne Maynard and Carolyn Cardozo from Pivotal Solutions. Anne Maynard is a senior human rights professional with over 25 years of practical experience managing all areas of human resources. She has extensive experience in employee relations, full cycle, recruitment, performance management, organizational design, and employment legislation gained from years of experience working for large, mid-sized, and small companies, as well as running her own consulting business. Using a client-centered approach, she has been able to build strong relationships quickly and achieve exceptional results across all levels of business. After her, Carolyn Cardozo will be speaking. Carolyn Cardozo is a human resources professional with over 10 years of experience managing various areas of human resources management. She has graduated from York University with an honors degree in human resource management and has been working for the Pivotal team for 6 years. She has various areas of expertise, including recruitment, employee relations, compensation, and performance management. Welcome, Anne and Carolyn.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Caroline and I are very pleased to represent Pivotal Solutions today and be able to speak to you on the topic of long COVID in the workplace. We're going to approach pretty much the same as Mike did, a little bit from the employee perspective and also from the employer perspective. And then we'll discuss some recommendations and trends that we've seen that we feel might be helpful to make you aware of. So, no doubt, there has been a great sense of uncertainty and fear around long COVID, and it's led to a complicated and challenging environment for managers and HR to be able to support employees as well as to continue operationally. The fact that this disease is so novel and not yet fully understood with limited data makes it a big challenge in the workplace. Due to the fact of the disease being poorly understood, often people with this new health challenge may find themselves being dismissed by their family, their friends, colleagues, and even some clinicians. Employers can actually step up and offer a great amount of relief by providing empathy and acknowledgement that this is a real disease, and then to provide as much support as they can reasonably do in the work environment. An article put out on CBC just over 6 months ago stated that more than 150,000 people in Canada experience long COVID symptoms, and these can last, as we heard, many months. The post-COVID-19 symptoms affect about 10% of those infected. So looking at from the employee perspective to start with, as mentioned in previous speakers, currently there are many common symptoms attributed to long COVID, challenges with concentration, fatigue, shortness of breath, and also anxiety and depression. The sheer volume of symptoms and variety of symptoms make it very difficult for employees, managers to support their employees as much as they'd like to, their employees facing long COVID. Symptoms can also be unpredictable, so there's no one procedure or process that fits all. Also, there could be the impact of COVID-19 on previous multiple symptoms that the employee had before this. They also suffer from, which can add to the impact of their daily functioning in the workplace. Daily activities in all parts of their lives are affected, as we've heard, not just the work environment. So there may be a lot of personal issues on top of work concerns causing extreme anxiety for the employee. This will affect the employee's performance, and employees may feel a constant fear for job loss, letting their manager or organization down, and not meeting performance expectations and goals. In addition, some employees may feel they may be missing out on promotions or increases, and then the financial impact will cause extra anxiety for the employee. Employees may feel a frustration that their symptoms and a sense of helplessness due to a lack of medical information that they can rely on to speak with their managers about. Many employees facing long COVID symptoms find working from home helpful as they can manage their symptoms in the comfort of their homes. and not around others who may not be supportive, and that the energy they have that's limited can be devoted to their work and not worry about commuting to the office. However, on the other hand, working from home in combination with long COVID symptoms can heighten a sense of isolation, not being part of the team, and a sense of missing out from the work and office culture. Employees who have moved to working totally from home as a part of an accommodation may have other issues as well, which may trigger certain symptoms such as family distractions, work role overload, or perhaps not being set up ergonomically, possibly lighting, chair situations that may impact their symptoms of headaches and muscle aches and make things worse. As well, adjusting to downtime in a home situation is more difficult, especially since the employee may be working at a slower pace, and then they will be working longer hours into the evening because of that. They may also feel very helpless to take the next step to return to work on a modified basis and need a very supportive manager and team to assist them. Some occupational stress factors to be aware of that can trigger symptoms include role ambiguity, role conflict, career goals, and job control. So the more clarity and communication around the role for the individual trying to resume their position, the better. Employees may find it very difficult to be transparent with their managers about what they can and can't do, but the more they can, the easier it is to set up accommodations that will work for them. If the employee is open to communicate their situation, they may find their team as well in a much better position to help with gaps and to jump in faster when the employee is at a position where they can't continue in the role. The more open the communication the employee has with their manager and quick check-ins, the easier the transition back to work will be. Now, looking at it from an employer perspective, most businesses have been focusing in the last couple of years on trying to do whatever they can with policies and procedures to prevent the spread of COVID in the workplace. Obviously, this is still ongoing, but now the employers need to change to a more supportive role for the employee with long COVID as they try to return to the job, either at the office or from home. Instead of making assumptions, managers need to try and understand long COVID the best they can and how it can be intermittent and unpredictable with varying degrees of illness and wellness. As Mike mentioned earlier, managers have to make reasonable accommodations to allow employees to continue to perform their essential functions as much as possible. Accommodations made with the employee will need to be revised and reevaluated ongoing. Things will change weekly for the employee trying to get back to their original job. Understand there will be no one single way to treat the employees as there are so many varied symptoms, but also keep in mind the road to recovery will be challenging and not straightforward. Managers will need to develop more individualized accommodations and processors when they're working with employees suffering from long COVID. Communication is vital with the employee during this time, as well as communication with the rest of the team. Work arrangements will need to be fluid to adjust to the employee's situation. Working with the employees to establish the accommodations, and both need to be in agreement from the beginning. Possible options including working from home, flexible hours, part-time, reduced caseloads, and possibly even the redeployment to a different role for a temporary time period are all things managers can look at. These arrangements will have to be tweaked and as dictated by the employee's health. Also, the employer needs to keep the door open for areas that they see the employee struggling with and jump in quickly. Don't wait till the employee is so overwhelmed and stressed that they have to go off totally. Managers need to partner with HR, if that is an option, and work on all facets of the employee's return to full workload. Communication with the whole team needs to be consistent, and the employee needs to feel they are a respected and vital part of the working team. Communication with the employee needs to be consistent, but established from the beginning how is best for the employee as far as contact. Once established, timelines and meetings need to be consistent so the employee feels part of the work culture. Challenges have been brought on with the pandemic in general, measuring employees' behavior and performance, and some managers have even abandoned performance management altogether and reduced the time that they speak one-on-one with their employees. However, this is an essential part of the employee-employer relationship. Management requires training in managing a remote work arrangement, as well as training in how to deal with different aspects of accommodations for the employee. Some managers may not accept remote work models well, and in fact, they may tend to micromanage their employee. This, of course, leads to a lack of trust on the employee's part and can create more anxiety for the employee. This is especially true in employees dealing with symptoms of long COVID. However, back to consistency, regular communication, and an open door for the employee to be able to reach out to their manager at all times is the key to making this a successful accommodation. Okay, I'm going to now turn to Caroline to speak about some recommendations and some trends in the workplace. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So jumping right into recommendations. So when we talk about having workplace guidelines and procedures, it's important to be clear. And the clearer you are, the better, as Anne mentioned. So this is something that's really true in general, but even more so when it comes to dealing with people with illnesses and symptoms, especially when they're sporadic. So to provide as much information as possible around the plan for continued business, around the expectations for the employee, around how performance will be managed, things like that. And this will provide less anxiety for the employee or the need for symptoms to be triggered and rehash. So this also helps reduce manager stress levels as well, and increase their motivation, both the manager and the employee, their motivation and their confidence, as expectations and procedures are well defined. This helps with the organization's resilience in times of uncertainty as well, and if effectively used. Next, identify the positions in the workplace that can and cannot be worked from home, and set a plan around both of these. So consider mental and physical health implications, especially with regards to the job design. Is the role overloaded? What are the occupational stress factors? Is the role at all ambiguous? The workspace, is the lighting okay? Is everything ergonomically sound? Does the employee have all the tools and equipment needed to be successful? As well as inter-organizational interactions. Is that supportive? Is the culture friendly? Is there effective communication with the supervisor, manager, or team for team collaboration? Is there an open door transparency, as Anne mentioned? Communication as well, is the regular check-ins with the team and employees. And then always aim to maintain and strengthen the performance management process, as it helps to communicate relevant information related to the organization's direction and goals to the employees, as well as to collect information, provide feedback to the employees on how things are going and what is expected of them. So this is important as it helps to foster that relationship and bond between employee and employer. Modification of working duties when it comes to those that cannot physically or cognitively do the same job as the day before can be challenging, but it may still need to be looked at and addressed to better accommodate the employee. I mentioned this as well already, but some other things that can be looked at that can be worked into the accommodation plan if feasible and reasonable include adjusting the output of work. So that could be made less for a certain amount of time, or the time worked can be reduced temporarily, or there may be a need for role sharing or transition altogether to a new role, or even changes within the greater team could be made. Maybe bringing on a temporary resource to assist for a period of time, having flexible hours, long lead times, for example, for work deadlines and events can also be useful. Scheduling something for a week out to provide sufficient time for an employee dealing with illness to prepare themselves fully. Organizations can offer to add additional benefits as well, or to expand their benefits programs to support employees' mental health and well-being. Offerings like telemedicine, family caregiving, mental health, and partnerships with holistic centers, for example, stipends for the gym or yoga, things like that. So a recent study was done and found that 91% of employees aged between 19 and 30 years old said they felt that there was a need for additional mental health support and benefits in their organization. So there's definitely a need in this area. Employer and employee relationships can be drastically affected by how accommodation is handled. So it's important to have a process in place and to ensure it's seen as fair. Also, as long as COVID seems to be varying in terms of symptoms and severity, as we know, in most people, accommodations plans should also be flexible, depending on the situation. Managers must be quick to intervene if they see employees struggling, as Anne said, and needs assistance, partner with HR early on for coaching. It also provides a nice sounding board for the employees as they can discuss concerns and stuff. It's new for them as well. I mean, employees transitioning into a new role or having reduced hours or whatever transition they are facing, whether they're going off work or back into work, it's critical that they have some coaching available, training or retraining for them in the process, and especially provided with the tools that they need in order to be successful.
Carolyn,
Okay, so
I'm really
I'll move on to
sorry. I do have to jump in here. We have really run out of time, I'm afraid. There are 4 panelists in this session, and so I'm so sorry I have to cut you off at this point.
Okay, no problem.
I'm really, really sorry. Folks, we will be, everything is being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube in June. And with permission, we will share slide decks if that's something that our speakers are open to doing. So keep an eye on our YouTube page when we can. Back to Gail.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is so much important information. Anne and Caroline, really appreciate you talking about suggestions for some of the workplace accommodations that would be helpful for employees. Our next presenter is Tim Lychy from Gallagher Group Benefit Services. Welcome, Tim. Tim, you're muted.
Thanks, Gail. Sorry about that. Thank you for having me on today. I just wanted to start by saying that for this meeting, I actually did speak to senior leadership in the insurance industry, including director level at the disability and primarily the long-term disability arms of insurance companies. And this has actually been unbelievable for me. I do believe they would benefit, and I will make a commitment to share a lot of the information that's been shared with me today with them, because I do think that would help everybody with long COVID going forward, because I think it's still very much not well communicated throughout our industry. The first slide, if I could put my deck up, please.
To share it, Tim.
To be able to share. And one of the things that the insurance industry is already starting to gather is that which will happen a bit later is antiviral drug medications used for the treatment of COVID-19 have not been separated yet. I do believe over time there will be better information that will link the long-term disability and the use of prescription medications. But right now on the antivirals, it hasn't been done yet. However, on the anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication, the insurance industry has seen about a 17% increase in utilization due to and attributed to pandemic increased levels of stress, confinement, as we all know. So just so you know, that medication increase is probably linked in some areas to long COVID users. It's just an assumption. One of the things in statistics, they are seeing the largest increase in usage in the age for antidepressant medication between 25 and 34. Okay, next slide. as we go through the slide deck, one of the things that you'll see is that about 15% of all short-term disability claims, and a little bit higher when Omicron hit in the end of 2021, has been for short-term disability claims. Those average durations for COVID-19 are about 1 to 1.5 weeks longer than pre-pandemic. So they're longer on the short term. Which you will find, as I did, very confusing, is that for long haul COVID as a diagnosis showing up in LTD, it is happening, but it is not, it's representing a very small number of claims. And we're looking in the small single digits, which may not be what you would have thought based on today's discussion. I think the insurance industry is finding that, as you've heard, the condition is not fully understood by the medical community. It also, when they're getting claims in, it may manifest and be different by individual. So symptoms are different, and the impact on one's function and its longevity are different by individual. One of the other things, and this shocked me, and they are stating that, treatments are still evolving, as we all know, and I'm learning today, but they are stating that they don't feel that there is today a known cure, which is disheartening. I'm a couple slides ahead, sorry. One of the other things that when a claim, and if you go one more slide, please, one of the things that the insurance industry is finding when managing long-term disability and long-term COVID specifically, there are really hard systems when the insurance company gets the information in that you can test. They're very objective, clear damage to the body, lung, heart failure, etc. And they're fairly straightforward to assess. What is a challenge for the industry are soft symptoms. They're more subjective, brain fog, fatigue, shortness of breath. These symptoms, they impact the same way someone can perform their occupation, but they're very difficult to prove and give in medical test procedural terms. So that is a challenge that people are finding. There also is, as has been said before, a lack of uniformity in the definition of long haul COVID and how to diagnose it. Now, the insurance industry had some comments on why they were speculating they did not have a lot of long-term claims. They were saying, and I think Sarah said it in her talk earlier, which was quite moving, is that people don't think they're going to go longer. They don't know how long it's going to go, and maybe they're not taking the steps to make the long-term disability claim. Again, a lot of the symptoms do, in some cases, reduce over time, but others, the industry itself is thinking that potentially vaccination rates and are having an impact on it. Again, speculation from the insurance industry. Now, just to be clear, insurers do recognize that some individuals have symptom severity that are very significant, and they are significant with the activities and struggling with daily living, and they cannot work, okay? One of the things that is challenging to them as adjudicators is they're saying that the symptoms sometimes are sort of a constellation of others: chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, even post-concussion syndrome. So when claims are coming in, it may not be the primary diagnosis, it may be the secondary. So again, as more recording and more statistics come through, we'll get better analysis. But one of the things that everybody will need to be aware of is that the claim durations can be longer, and the return to work expectations and planning, which you've heard from some of the other speakers, can be a challenge. And it can also be a challenge with your own employer or the employer where you come from, which is where is the best opportunity to return to work. So claimants may be hesitant to return to work in person, especially if they cannot be accommodated in a socially distanced way, like working from home. So some of the challenges with long COVID and long-term disability is that accommodation. But I just wanted to make clear in speaking with the insurers, yes, there's a small number, but they do believe as an industry that there are permanently disabled situations that the claims will be eligible for. And I think as an industry, we need to actually get people to apply more if they're being hesitant now. I have some personal experience right now with two situations. And I want to say from my heart is, in the situations where people are suffering from long COVID, be very clear. It's difficult to gather the information from their physician, who is treating physician who has no time. Gather the information and fill the claim forms up, working with your employer, it's overwhelming. The biggest concern I see is that people are having trouble going through the process. They need help. So in this one situation, the insurance company did terminate the claim, and it just devastated the individual, and they needed help. With help and proper information and gathering your physician, gathering the employer, gathering yourself and getting the information, I think it's something that needs more help, and the insurance industry is willing to work better in these areas. They just need more communication. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That's very helpful. Insurance is a very important part of this entire picture, and I really appreciate your perspective and the encouragement for people to sort of take the steps in order to consider their insurance needs around this. Our next presenter is Jessica DeMars, sorry, and we have heard from Jessica this morning. So welcome back, Jessica.
Hi, thanks. I'll be quick. I'll be able to hopefully catch us up here. I'm just going to share my screen. And give me a moment just to swap things around. Okay, and so I'm just going to speak a little bit to my experience working with individuals living with long COVID and trying to navigate return to work. And a lot of this was actually already being recognized, so I don't, like I said, have to spend a lot of time on it. Again, we just want to really recognize what we're dealing with long COVID, and that we know that, again, it's a diverse range of heterogeneous and multi-system presentations, so it makes it difficult to come up with a plan that's going to suit everyone. And so in the face of that, we really have to look at those return to work and rehabilitation plans as individualized and adjusted. So we're not going to be able to say, hey, here's our normal 8-week return to work plan that we've used for, say, a musculoskeletal injury. We really have to kind of throw that all out and look at the person that's in front of us and how they're presenting and how we can best accommodate what's going on with them. This is a kind of a handout that was is available really just online from the Faculty of Occupational Medicine and Royal College of Physicians in the UK, and it kind of again highlights what the other speakers were talking about, but there's a few important points that I'd like to note on here. And one of these is that the employees do not need to be 100% fit to return to work. A supportive return to work program can be beneficial to the recovery process. Individuals with long COVID are often not able to do normal activities of daily living. So I would be very careful about encouraging someone to return to work who is not able to shower every day or who cannot prepare a meal for themselves or their family. So they would definitely not be at 100%, but we need to be careful about suggesting that people return to work when they are not even able to do basic activities of daily living. So that absolutely has to happen first and foremost, is that they need to be able to do just those basics. Some of the examples of the adjustments, again, previously spoken to: alteration in number of days or hours worked, shorter days, more breaks, and I'll talk about that in a second. Considering what we need for returning to work is that gradually increasing the days or hours, again, has to be not based on an arbitrary timeline. This week, we're going to start at 2 hours, and next week, we're going to go to 3 hours, and the week after, we're going to go to 4. It really has to be, we're going to start at 2 hours, see how you do. Monitor that response, Okay, are you tolerating that? Does this mean that you have not lost the ability to do things at home? Okay, great. And then we're going to add on to that. So those become really important, because what we don't want people to do, of course, is head back to work and then fail at home in their day-to-day life. So now they are no longer able to prepare meals or take care of other family members or anything like that in the interest of working. So for those that are on here that are living with long COVID, things that you want to reconsider before you are thinking about returning to work is, are you capable of handling personal household activities of daily living? So do you have the ability to do that? How long does it take you to rest and recover from those? Then looking at what are your work demands in terms of the cognitive components, the physical components, the emotional components, because we know that all three of those can lead to that post-exertional symptom exacerbation. And when we are working with individuals with long COVID, our kind of only tool that we have right now is pacing. And pacing means we do a little bit and we rest. One of the tools within that pacing would be something like, well, we're going to do a little bit of a physical task and then we'll have a rest, and then they'll switch it up to a cognitive task. So sometimes that can be a way of increasing ability, although not always. Again, what can be adapted and can't be adapted in terms of tasks, hours? Is there job sharing situations or a buddy system where you are working collaboratively and someone takes on a little bit more of the physical load so that you don't have to take that on? Also really considering that commuting time and energy. So if you're going back to work for 2 hours, but it takes you an hour to get to work, that's now a 4-hour day. So you have to consider that. When you're thinking, okay, I think I'm ready to return to work. I think I can try this. And again, in your workspace, is there opportunity to rest or recover during the day, and truly rest, not just sit at your computer and read emails, but truly rest. From my clinical experience, unfortunately, I would say that most of the individuals that I've been working with have been unable to return to previous level of work or hours. They're unable to return to the same job. So they struggle with finding alternate duties. There are things like flight attendants, nurses, physiotherapists that all I've seen with long COVID, and you can't return to that same job capacity. And sometimes those jobs don't have the ability to accommodate. Some return to reduced hours and duties, but then experience a relapse and then must go back off work. So again, speaks to that episodic nature. I will say that more success seems to come from those who can work from home, mainly because you've gotten rid of the commuting requirements and there's an easier rest recovery ability. So they can work a little bit and then go lay down in their bed and rest and recover. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about rest and recovery. And just very briefly, because I know we are time crunched, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly to speak on what's going on in terms of researching episodic disability and long COVID.
Thanks, Jessica. So this final slide highlights a research study that is currently underway. It's funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And I have the ability to be a part of this research project that's co-led with Darren Brown, physiotherapist and co-chair of Long COVID Physio. It's a collaboration and it takes, the aim of this study is to explore the experiences of episodic disability from the perspectives of people living with long COVID in Canada, the UK, the United States, and Ireland. And to establish a patient-reported or self-reported questionnaire that could capture the presence, severity, and episodic nature of episodic disability over time, specifically among and with adults living with long COVID. So we're hoping this is a 2-phase study, the first including semi-structured one-on-one interviews with adults living with HIV with long COVID in 4 countries, followed by a measurement study following up from there, which will hopefully be able to help to lend some evidence towards patient-reported outcome measures and tools in which to capture the experiences of episodic disability among the community. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you, everyone, for inviting us to speak on this and give our perspective from working with individuals with long COVID.
Thanks very much, Jessica and Kelly. Once again, very helpful. Our next speakers will focus on research related to COVID-19 and work. Again, we'll have hopefully have time for questions and answers after the next two speakers. I'd like to call on Dr. Sedav Kochak from Toronto Tech Institute, speaking about her research on COVID-19 and artificial intelligence. Dr. Kochak?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. So can everybody hear me okay? Good.
Yes, thank you.
Let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Give me 2 seconds. Okay, so everybody, I believe everybody can see my screen with the cover page, right? Okay,
yes,
excellent. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today. And thank you all for participating in this session. I'm going to talk about Vector Institute's collaboration project on uncovering COVID-19 long haulers using natural language processing for social media. Let's get started. Let's kick this off by looking at the agenda of my talk. First, I'll introduce myself, then I'll take you to the Vector Institute and talk a little bit of what the Institute does for those who don't know. Then I will introduce Vector Institute Industry Innovation project related to COVID-19. Then I'm going to talk about our recent project about long haulers and explain our methodology. Finally, I will review some of the preliminary results and summary of the project. A little bit about myself. I'm the project manager at Vector Institute, where I provide AI project development and management support collaborations between our industry sponsors, as well as our industry sponsors and our researchers in building and applying AI technologies to address challenges. I'm holding a PhD from Data Science Lab at Ryerson, where I was focusing on modeling software-intensive systems for sustainability. Prior joining to the Vector Institute, I spent my career building on managing data-intensive R&D projects and AI partnerships at SOCIP Consortium at the University of Toronto. Let me talk a bit about Vector Institute. The Institute is a non-for-profit research institute with its mission to lead Ontario's effort to build and sustain AI-based innovation, growth, and productivity in Canada by focusing on the transformative potential of machine learning, especially deep learning. We work together with our AI partners around Canada, with industry sponsors and public institutions to ensure that they have the people, they have skills and resources to best in class at the use of AI. Vector, founded in 2017 by academics from University of Toronto and entrepreneurs who have faced challenges in creating commercial AI technologies. Vector's industry innovation team leads industry collaborations for driving commercial impact of AI. Our projects bring industries and researchers together to apply state-of-the-art solutions to specific industry-related or research problems. In this slide, I would like to talk about two recent research projects where we utilize the state-of-the-art natural language processing techniques to help medical professionals about combating COVID-19. First project we launched right after the pandemic started in March 2019. We formed a special interest group from our researchers and industry sponsors to develop question and answering systems that can help the medical community develop answers to high priority scientific questions related to COVID-19. Then in 2021, we formed another special interest group to develop end-to-end framework using, again, NLP approaches, understanding COVID long haulers phenomena from social media. I will be talking about more details about the long haulers project in coming slides. In the project, we utilize natural language processing, which is a field of AI, and build an end-to-end framework for gaining insight about COVID long haulers from social media. As we know, long haulers are referred to as patients who have symptoms, persisting symptoms, or recurring for weeks or months following acute COVID illness. At the moment, as we all know, it's unclear what causes this persistence, late onset, development, or recurrence of the symptoms in previously infected patients. So social media is often turned to by patients as an outlet to express their experiences with illness. Knowing this, we propose social media may be a useful aid for researchers and clinicians in gaining, for example, important insights into clinical characteristics arising due to emerging illnesses. In this work specifically, we explore the utility of publicly available, self-reported, user-generated conversations on social media towards capturing terms related to long COVID symptoms, recoveries, and experiences. These terms can then guide investigation into clinical databases, thereby accelerating to discovery, studies, descriptions, and hopefully treatment of unexpected consequences from COVID. So as you may imagine, language processing with social media is challenging due to the nature of user-generated data. For example, the language are very informal, it has a short context and content that is very noisy and sparse. To respond to this challenge, we built end-to-end pipeline and utilize deep learning-based entity extraction. So let me walk you through our pipeline. First, we created a data set out of around 460,000 tweets from August 2019 to June 2021. Each data point contains a tweet, timestamp, geographical coordinates if available, users' locations, and users' description, profile description. And we use special hashtags to retrieve these data, such as long COVID, COVID long, long haulers, etc. Then we move on to cleaning stage, and then we exclude some unnecessary content such as retweet URLs, and we also remove non-English tweets. And then usernames and mentions were hashed to identify the data before we move on to the next step, which is self-reporting. So the next step is self-reporting. We use different filtering methods to capture self-reports. Then we move on to our entity extraction steps, where we use different models and fine-tune them using topic-related benchmark data sets, which include unstructured notes from the research patient data register at Partners Healthcare to extract relevant entities from the tweets. In addition, we passed our corpus of tweets through MetaMap Lite to augment entities extracted by the models. So MetaMap Lite is the tool that uses NLP and computational linguistic techniques to extract entities associated with clinical concepts that fall under various categories, such as signs and symptoms or diseases or syndromes. But it has a limited coverage of expressions such as brain fog. In order to overcome this limitation, we introduced an additional approach using AMIA-3 dataset, which consists of clinical concepts from tweets and their corresponding and human-assigned medical dictionary for regulatory activities codes. And then the next step is our normalization of the extracted symptoms, whereby they are aligned to corresponding unique concepts in a target knowledge base, which is derived from a top scholarly article in the long COVID field from which we manually extracted and recorded a set of concepts, which is around 256 symptoms into a database. Last step, but is not least, we have our outputs where we have list of symptoms and co-occurrence, etc. So this slide shows our augmentation pipeline that I mentioned in my previous slide. Since we don't have much time, I will not go through this. So in this table shows our extraction evaluation compared to medical practitioner evaluation. So tweets were synthetically created. We observed that models have picked up most of the terms as humans. So this is the human extraction, this is the model extraction. So occasionally these models have extracted non-clinical description of symptoms. For example, my heart rate instead of heart rate. Other times, model failed to retrieve relevant terms. In example, in the second tweet, the model didn't identify cannot taste or smell. The terms extracted by our extraction technique showed us that including MetaMap and AMIA datasets for fine-tuning of the model could potentially produce a model that better captures social media text. However, we also observed that this often captures fewer entities than are actually present, and this could be due to sparse labeling. So here you can see example of how our normalization step work in given two synthetically generated tweets. In the tweet, symptoms such as lingering fatigue and fatigued have been normalized to fatigue. So this slide shows a demo of our simple dashboard that we built. It shows the different models on the side, and you can add the tweets, and then you can get the output of the extraction and then the normalization output as well. So here I would like to show you some of the preliminary results from our fine-tuned models. The one on the left figure shows the occurrence frequency of the top 20 symptoms here. So we observed that there are similar symptoms such as fatigue and shortness of breath that we have seen in the physician-reported standardized symptoms. On the other hand, some extracted symptoms or terms such as brain fog commonly reported in the social media data, but it's not well-defined terms list used by the physician providers. So we also observed that the loss of taste and smell, which we have seen in the literature, where the clinical data have been reported, made to the top of the symptom list. However, we haven't seen in our top 10 frequency list. There are some terms clearly appear to be conditions rather than symptoms. For example, as you can see in the list, death or cancer. So this indicates that we can extend the capability of extraction as well as the data augmentation. So regarding co-occurrence, we've seen that the co-occurrences match with the literature data from the US-based retrospective cohort study that we've seen in the literature. For instance, fatigue and abnormal breathing or shortness of breath tends to co-occur frequently in most of the patients with long COVID. Importance of this is that the Twitter allows only limited words so as patients can only express a limited number of terms or symptoms in their tweet. So in this way of looking at the symptoms can generate new insights for medical professionals. So in this slide, show another, the dashboard of our the tool I mentioned earlier. So this interface shows the symptoms frequency over time. As you can select the individual symptoms, and then you can select the timeline, and then you can get the frequency over time. And then you can also see the world map here, and then you can see the symptom frequency over space. But just to remind you that these are only English tweets. So in this slide, I would like to show you the occurrence frequency of top 5 symptoms over time using our fine-tuned models. Our observation here is that the long COVID filter clearly removes many of the tweets from the dataset prior to emergence of the COVID-19 in December 2019, and more so emergence of the long COVID as a condition or a term around like a mid-2020s. However, there remains a baseline of noise that gets through, as you can see here in the left side of the curve. So finally, this work has shown that it is possible to gain some insight into the population experience of disease using social media and NLP models. There remain significant limitations, of course, with respect to the recognition of the individual person's experiences as opposed to opinion, as well as aligning, say, common vernacular or recognized medical terminology though we have made progress in narrowing that gap with this work. Despite these limitations, we are confident that there is significant value in the learnings and methodologies outlined in this study. While the extracted terms are not as accurate as we would like, they remain useful as a means of identifying insights to the evolution of the novel illnesses, in this case, COVID-19. But certainly one can imagine how that could easily apply to future emerging illnesses. With the fewer adjustments, the simple pipeline may be extensible to the other applications, such as emerging infectious diseases or rare or neglected diseases.
Thank you.
So with
Thank you
that,
so much, Dr. Siddiq. I'm sorry we're
this is the last one.
Time.
Yeah, I know. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you.
Very interesting use of social media and AI in this case. Thank you for your perspectives on that.